So we are having such beautiful weather this morning that I decided I had to record the beginning of our next book outside. But I am still on library property. Can you guys figure out where it is that I'm sitting? So we are going to start with Lassie Come Home, the first and second chapters today. And you'll get to hear some birds chirping in the background, hopefully, and not too much of cars driving past would be my hope. So we'll see how it goes as far as volume. All right, so shall we get started? This is Lassie Come Home, written by Eric Knight. Our first picture is Lassie. Not for sale. Everyone in Greenall Bridge knew Sam Carraclaw's Lassie. In fact, you might say that she was the best-known dog in the village, and for 3 reasons. First, because nearly every man in the village agreed that she was the finest collie he had ever laid eyes on. This was praise indeed, for Greenall Bridge is in the county of Yorkshire, and of all places in the world, it is here that the dog is really king. In that bleak part of northern England, the dog seems to thrive as it does nowhere else. The wind and the cold rains sweep over the flat moorlands, making the dogs rich-coated and as sturdy as the people who are living there. The people love dogs and are clever at raising them. You can go into any one of the hundreds of small mining villages in this largest of England's counties and see, walking at the heels of humbly clad workmen, dogs of such a fine breed and aristocratic bearing as to arouse the envy of wealthier dog fanciers from other parts of the world. And Greenall Bridge was like other Yorkshire villages. Its men knew and understood and loved dogs, and there were many perfect ones that walked at men's heels. But they all agreed that if a finer dog than Sam Carraclaw's tricolour collie had ever been bred in Greenall Bridge, then it must have been long before they were born. Because they don't remember, right? But there was another reason why Lassie was so well known in the village. It was because, as the women said, you can set a clock by her. That had begun many years before, when Lassie was a bright, harum-scarum yearling. One day, Sam Carraclaw's boy, Joe, had come home bubbling with excitement. "Mother, I come out of school today, and who do you think was sitting there waiting for me? Lassie. Now, how do you think she knew where I was?" "She must have picked up your scent, Joe. That's all I can figure out." Whatever it was, Lassie was waiting at the school gate the next day, and the next. And the weeks and the months and the years had gone past, and it had always been the same. Women glancing through the windows of their cottages, or shopkeepers standing in the doors on High Street, would see the proud black, white, and golden sable dog go past on a steady trot, and would say, "Must be 5 minutes to 4, there goes Lassie." Rain or shine, the dog was always there, waiting for a boy, one of dozens who would come pelting across the concrete playground. But for the dog, the only one who mattered. Always there would be the moment of happy greeting, and then, together, the boy and the dog would go home. For 4 years, it had always been the same. Lassie was a well-loved figure in the daily life of the village. Almost everyone knew her. But most of all, the people of Greenall Bridge were proud of Lassie, because she stood for something that they could not have explained readily. It had something to do with their pride, and their pride had something to do with money. Generally, when a man raised an especially fine dog, someday it would stop being a dog and instead would become something on 4 legs that was worth money. It was still a dog, of course, but now it was something else, too, for a rich man might hear of it, or the alert dealers or kennelmen might see it, and then they would want to buy it. While a rich man may love a dog just as truly as a poor man, and there is no difference in them in this, there is a difference between them in the way that they must look at money. For the poor man sits and thinks about how much coal he will need that winter, and how many pairs of shoes will be necessary, and how much food his children ought to have to keep them sturdy. And then he will go home and say, "Now, I had to do it, so don't plague me. We'll raise another dog someday, and you'll all love it just as much as you did this one." That way, many fine dogs had gone from homes in Greenall Bridge, but not Lassie. Why, the whole village knew that not even the Duke of Rudling had been able to buy Lassie from Sam Carraclaw, the very Duke himself who lived in his great estate a mile beyond the village, and who had his kennels full of fine dogs. For 3 years, the Duke had been trying to buy Lassie from Sam Carraclaw, and Sam had merely stood his ground. "It's no use raising your price again, your lordship," he would say. "It's just, well, she's not for sale for no price." The village knew all about that, and that was why Lassie meant so much to them. She represented some sort of pride that money had not been able to take away from them. Yet, dogs are owned by men, and men are bludgeoned by fate, and sometimes there comes a time in a man's life when fate has beaten him so that he must bow his head and decide that he must eat his pride so that his family may eat bread. Here is the beginning of chapter 2. It is titled, "I Never Want Another Dog." That sounds sad. The dog was not there. That was all Joe Carraclaw knew. That day he had come out of school with the others and had gone racing across the yard in a rush of gladness that you see at all schools, all the world over, when lessons are over for the day. Almost automatically, by a habit ingrained through hundreds of days, he had gone to the gate where Lassie always waited, and she was not there. What do you think happened? Joe Carraclaw stood, a sturdy, pleasant-faced boy, trying to reason it out. The broad forehead above his brown eyes became wrinkled. At first, he found himself unable to realize that what his senses told him could be true. He looked up and down the street. Perhaps Lassie was late. He knew that that could not be the reason, though, for animals are not like human beings. Human beings have watches and clocks, and yet they are always finding themselves 5 minutes behind time. Animals need no machines to tell time. There is something inside them that is more accurate than clocks. It is a time sense, and it never fails them. They know surely and truly exactly when it's time to take part in some well-established routine of life. Joe Carraclaw knew that. He'd often talked it over with his father, asking him how it was that Lassie knew when it was time to start for the school gate. Lassie could not be late. Joe Carraclaw stood in the early summer sunshine thinking of this. Suddenly, a flash came into his mind. Perhaps she had been run over. Even as this thought brought panic to him, he was dismissing it. Lassie was far too well trained to wander carelessly into the streets. She always moved daintily and surely along the pavements of the village. Then, too, there was very little traffic of any kind in Greenall Bridge. The main motor road went along the valley by the river a mile away. Only a small road came up to the village, and that became merely narrow footpaths farther along when it reached the flat moorland. Perhaps someone had stolen Lassie. Yet this could hardly be true. No stranger could so much as put a hand on Lassie, unless one of the Carraclaws were there to order her to submit to it. And moreover, she was far too well known for miles around Greenall Bridge for anyone to dare steal her. Where could she be? Joe Carraclaw solved his problem as hundreds of thousands of boys solve their problems the world over. He ran home to tell his mother. Down the main street he went, racing as fast as he could. Without pausing, he went past the shops on High Street, through the village, to the little lane going up the hillside, up the lane and through the gate, and along a garden path, and then through the cottage door to cry out, "Mother! Mother, something's happened to Lassie. She didn't meet me." As soon as he said it, Joe Carraclaw knew that there was something wrong. No one in the cottage jumped up and asked him what the matter was. No one seemed afraid that something dire had happened to their fine dog. Joe noticed that. He stood with his back to the door, waiting. His mother stood with her eyes down toward the table where she was setting out the tea-time meal. For a second, she was still. Then, she looked at her husband. Joe's father was sitting on a low stool before the fire, his head turned toward his son. Slowly, without speaking, he turned back to the fire and stared into it intently. "What is it, Mother?" Joe cried suddenly. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Carraclaw set a plate on the table slowly, and then she spoke. "Well, somebody's got to tell him," she said, as if to the air. Her husband made no move. She turned her head toward her son. "You might as well know it right off, Joe," she said. "Lassie won't be waiting at school for you no more, and there's no use crying about it." "Why not? What's happened to her?" Mrs. Carraclaw went to the fireplace and set the kettle over it. She spoke without turning. "Because she's sold. That's why not." "Sold?" the boy echoed, his voice high. "Sold? What did you sell her for? Lassie, what did you sell her for?" His mother turned angrily. Now, she's sold and gone and done with, so don't ask any more questions. They won't change it. She's gone, so that's that. Let's say no more about it. But Mother, the boy's cry rang out high and puzzled. His mother interrupted him. Now, no more. Come and have your tea. Come on, sit you down. Obediently, the boy went to his place at the table. The woman turned to the man at the fireplace. Come on, Sam, and eat, though Lord knows it's poor enough stuff to set out for tea. The woman grew quiet as her husband rose with an angry suddenness. Then, without speaking a word, he strode to the door, took his cap from a peg, and went out. The door slammed behind him. For a moment after, the cottage was silent. Then the woman's voice rose, scolding in a tone. Now, see what you've done? Got thy father angry. I suppose you're all happy now. Wearily, she sat in her chair and stared at the table. For a long time, the cottage was silent. Joe knew it was unfair of his mother to blame him for what was happening. Yet he knew, too, that it was his mother's way of covering up her own hurt. It was exactly the same as her scolding. That was the way it was with people in those parts. They were rough, stubborn people, used to living a rough, hard life. When anything happened that touched their emotions, they covered up their feelings. The women scolded and chattered to hide their hurts. They did not mean anything by it. After it was over, "Come on, Joe, eat up." His mother's voice was soft and patient now. The boy stared at his plate, unmoving. Here's a picture of the boy staring at his plate. Come on, Joe, eat your bread and butter. Look, nice new bread I just baked today. Don't you want it? The boy bent his head lower. I don't want any, he said in a whisper. Oh, dogs, 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 his mother flared. Her voice rose in anger again. All this trouble over one dog. Well, if you ask me, I'm glad Lassie's gone. That I am. It's much trouble to take care of as a child. Now she's gone and it's done with, and I'm glad. I'm glad. Mrs. Carraclaw shook her plump self and sniffed. Then she took her handkerchief from her apron pocket and blew her nose. Finally, she looked at her son, still sitting, unmoving. She shook her head sadly and spoke. Again, her voice was patient and kind. Joe, come here, she said. The boy rose and stood by his mother. She put her plump arm around him and spoke. Her head turned to the fire. Look, Joe, you're getting to be a big lad now, and you can understand. You see, well, you know things aren't so good for us these days. You know how it is, and we've got to have food on the table. We've got to pay our rent. Lassie was worth a lot of money, and, well, we couldn't afford to keep her, that's all. Now, these are poor times, and you mustn't upset thy father. He's worrying enough as it is, and, well, that's all. She's gone. Young Joe Carraclaw stood by his mother in the cottage. He did understand. Even a boy of 12 years in Greenall Bridge knew what poor times were. For years, for as long as children could remember, their fathers had worked in the Wellington pit beyond the village. They had gone on shift, off shift, carrying their snap boxes of food and their collier's lanterns. They had worked at bringing up the rich coal. Then times had become poor. The pit went on slack time, and the men earned less. Sometimes the work had picked up, and the men had gone back on full time. Then everyone was glad. It did not mean luxurious living for them, for in the coal mining villages people lived a hard life at best. But it was a life of courage and family unity, at least, and if the food that was set on the table was plain, there was enough of it to go around. Only a few months ago, the pit had closed down altogether. The big wheel at the top of the shaft spun no more. The men no longer flowed into a stream to the pit yard at the shift changes. Instead, they signed on at the labor exchange. They stood by the corner, by the labor exchange, waiting for work, but no work came. It seemed that they were in what the newspapers called the stricken areas, sections of the country from which all industry had gone. Whole villages of people were out of work. There was no way of earning a living. The government gave the people a dole, a weekly sum of money, so that they could stay alive. Joe knew this. He had heard people talking in the village. He had seen the men at the labor exchange, and he knew that his father no longer went to work. He knew, too, that his father and mother never spoke of it before him, that in their rough, kind way they had tried to keep their burdens of living from bearing also on his young shoulders. Though his brain told him these things, his heart still cried for Lassie, but he silenced it. He stood steadily and then asked one question. Could we buy her back someday, Mother? Now, Joe, she was a very valuable dog, and she's worth too much for us. But we'll get another dog someday. Just wait. Times might pick up, and then we'll get another pup. Wouldn't you like that? Joe Caraclaw bent his head and shook it slowly. His voice was only a whisper. I don't ever want another dog. Never. I only want Lassie. And that is the end for today. I hope that the wind and the machinery that was around wasn't too loud while I was reading. Anyway, it was enjoyable to read outside in the beautiful sunshine. Have a great evening. Bye.